Thank you very much. Good evening. I'd like to thank the President and all the members. Thank you so much for the honour of being here to speak with you tonight, although I didn't see the good name of the University of Stirling being besmirched as being part of the argument this evening. But it's an honour to be here tonight. I'm with a charity called Detention Action. We've worked over the last 30 years directly in immigration detention. We work to support people being held under immigration powers in the UK. We work with hundreds of people each year to provide emotional and practical support. And the other side of our work is campaigning. So we campaign and advocate for a fairer system, for a fairer picture in the UK, for fundamental reform of our detention, deportation and asylum laws. I think actually that it's clear to all of us in this chamber really that the government is engineering a crisis regarding refugees in the United Kingdom. It's not the first government to do that. There's in fact a long-standing tradition for governments, both in the UK and abroad, for governments to distract from other issues, perhaps other failings or other perceived failings, by making scapegoats of refugees or people seeking asylum. This government is no different, except perhaps particularly recently, in the last few years and indeed recent months, in terms of the tone of its rhetoric and its hostility and the extremity of its particularly the last two pieces of immigration legislation that have been put before the Houses of Parliament. But over the last 25 years, we've seen both Conservative and Labour-led governments carry out policies that to varying levels have and rhetoric that have stigmatised and taken away the rights of people seeking sanctuary in the UK. We at Detention Action and other groups like us believe that this doesn't need to be a party political issue, that it can and should transcend party politics, and that ultimately the hostile environment, however it's expressed or referred to, benefits in the end no one. I wanted to say a little more on three main points. Firstly, what the government is doing. Secondly, the consequences of what it's doing. And thirdly, and I think this is important to end on a positive note, how things could and indeed need to be different. But I wanted to say something first, and this is partly in response to Charles's main point. Firstly, to acknowledge that in an international context, there absolutely is a crisis for refugees in the world today. That's undeniable. As at the most recent figures, the UNHCR's figures in the middle of 2022, there were around an estimate of around 103 million people displaced around the world. And that's a number that has risen dramatically over the last few years and unfortunately is only going to rise with the current situations in Ukraine, the very recent breakdown in Sudan and other crises. And sadly, even if all wars ended next week and every repressive regime was replaced by a free and liberal democratic one, the nature of climate change over the coming years and decades means that more people are going to be on the move than ever. So the 21st century is going to be to a large part defined how we respond to mass migration. And that's going to need genuine international cooperation and humanity and great resource on many sides. But mass migration doesn't necessarily mean a migration crisis. But that's a very different point to saying that there is a refugee crisis as the government has been framing it in the UK today. There is a crisis that has been manufactured in UK terms. And we see it in people forced to take small boat crossings to the UK. As a clear result of government policy, which has actually eroded almost entirely, as Fiona made the point, the safe and legal routes that such as those existed in any case. And ultimately, we need to recognise that no one benefits from people having to cross the channel in dangerous vessels, risking their lives. That's not what anyone should want. No one benefits from that ultimately, apart from the people smugglers. And arguably from politicians carrying out rhetoric around it, although in the end I believe not even they do. But I'm afraid with respect to Charles, I don't believe it's plausible to claim that this government is in any way seeking to address the crisis. And I think if it did want to do that, there are some very different things it would need to do. So firstly, just to return to what the government are doing. So we're seeing particularly draconian language and proposed legislation at the moment, and many of us will be aware of that. The current illegal migration bill currently being debated in the House of Lords is effectively a ban on asylum, onwards eliminating the right to seek protection from persecution in the UK. The bill is based essentially on an inverted version of reality. As Fiona described, the government insists that people should be taken legal routes, but these essentially don't exist on any scale. And indeed, you can see that they don't exist merely by the fact that people are continuing to cross the channel in small boats in such large numbers. Why would anyone do that if they felt there was another choice? And it was telling that when asked a very clear and sensible question by Tim Loughton, who's speaking for the opposition tonight, a few months ago, when the Home Secretary was asked how would a young person needing to claim asylum in the UK in Africa, how would they do that? How would they do that in a way that was seen as legal and was safe? She couldn't answer that, and that's because those routes don't exist for most people. The government is also portraying people crossing the channel and arriving through other so-called irregular means as economic migrants. That's simply untethered from reality. The vast majority of people who come by small boats and other irregular means claim asylum, and a clear majority, as Fiona noted, of those people are granted leave to remain. Essentially, in any case, even if those numbers were different, crucially, any asylum application can only be fairly considered on its own merits and individual details of a case. The government also claims that there's an enormous backlog of asylum cases because of this growth of people arriving by irregular means. Well, there's certainly a huge backlog of asylum cases. It's peaked at over 160,000 in recent months. But research carried out by the Migration Observatory here in Oxford has shown that there are a number of other key factors behind that growth in the backlog. In particular, the reduction in the rate of asylum decisions being made by the Home Office over the past 6 years, and government policies such as inadmissibility. Those are government choices. It's important to note as well that although the rates of people arriving irregularly have grown, asylum applications as a whole were actually higher 20 years ago, but people are arriving in a different way. I'd like again to return to the point around 100 million. So the Home Secretary referenced 100 million people wanting to come to the UK when she unveiled the most recent immigration bill. Again, it's 103 million estimated to be displaced in the entire world, but a clear majority of those people actually haven't even been able to cross their own borders. They're internally displaced people. 69% of the remainder are in neighbouring countries to conflict zones, such as Pakistan and Jordan. I'd also like to refer briefly to the extremity of some of the languages, and particularly the Home Secretary's use of the term invasion to describe people arriving a few months ago, which is completely absurd, racist, and frankly language that is more reminiscent of the far right. So what are the consequences of what the government's doing? Well, the situation that is being created by the government does create a form of crisis because it creates and inflames stigmatisation, racism and discrimination towards people seeking sanctuary. We've seen ugly scenes towards asylum seekers as a consequence of this. For example, we've seen petrol bombs thrown by far-right activists at an asylum centre in recent months that was holding families. We've seen hotel accommodation holding men, women and children targeted in recent months. We already see tens of thousands of people detained indefinitely in the UK's immigration detention centres every year. We'll see and are seeing an increasing trend of the government flagrantly breaking international law. The illegal migration bill will almost certainly, and the government themselves have acknowledged concerns about this, be ultimately seen to be breaking the UN Refugee Convention, the European Convention on Human Rights and other key international treaties. Government actions, including the appalling Rwanda deal, are taking it into direct opposition with important and established international human rights bodies, with bad consequences for all of us. The government claimed that the illegal migration bill will stop criminal gangs and traffickers, but actually research has shown that it will actually enable these people at high human but also financial cost. So there are estimates of the accommodation needed to hold people who have been judged to have arrived here irregularly and will therefore be admissible has been estimated at 9.6 billion. Litigation of the Home Office's policies already cost the taxpayer nearly £13 million last year, and that's only going to rise. So thirdly and finally, before I wrap up, how could things be different? Well, we know things don't need to be like this. There are practical steps that need to be taken to transition our asylum system to something that genuinely supports those who desperately need it. First of all, we can open genuine, safe routes to the UK. We saw with the Ukraine crisis response that swift responses to help those genuinely in need can absolutely be set up where there's the will to do that. We can increase the rate of decision-making by hiring more decision-makers within the Home Office and tackle that enormous, at the moment, 6-figure backlog of people waiting for decisions. Again, people, it's worth stressing, the majority of whom will be recognised in the end as people who do need protection and who are currently costing people in just a hotel accommodation terms over £7 million per day as things stand. We can also work internationally with other nations and the UN to ensure better international protection systems so that people who need protection wherever they are in the world can get to safety quickly, and we can end squabbling, I'll be 2 minutes, end squabbling between richer nations over their responsibilities. Back in the UK, politicians can recognise that no one is benefiting from the current zero-sum game. Conservative and Labour have both made tackling the small boats issue in the way they are framing it as priorities, but this isn't reflected actually in polls of the public. A recent British Futures survey found that the issues around small boats crossings ranked only 14th as amongst a list of concerns by voters, behind such issues as the cost of living, the situation in the NHS, behind a number of other key issues, which clearly they would rather their government and their opposition parties and other parties were focusing on. I'd like to conclude by noting this. In the end, refugees are simply people. They're parents, their grandparents, their children, their grandchildren. They're people who've been forced, had lives turned upside down when they've been forced from their homes and their lives by violent forces beyond their control. Every day we at Detention Action speak to people held in detention for weeks, months, even years. They simply want to be free. They want to reconnect with family. They want to go to school and university. They want to provide for their own and their family's futures. They want to be safe. They came to the UK for help and for safety, and it's time we provided that. Thank you very much.